Welcome to this explainer. Today we're jumping right into a really powerful, documentary-style look at the aftermath of Karbala. Relying directly on the historical sources, we're going to trace the harrowing 7th century journey of a captive caravan, specifically the family of the Prophet Muhammad. We'll be looking at how, despite going through just unimaginable physical hardships, the records show them securing an absolutely incredible moral victory. Which brings us to the core question of today's explainer. How exactly does a captive caravan turn physical defeat into an eternal triumph? I mean, this is a story of profound resilience. It's essentially a historical masterclass in speaking truth to overwhelming power, all playing out against the really gritty cinematic backdrop of 7th century Arabia. Let's see how the historical sources map out this transformation. Section 1. The brutal journey. To start, the sheer mathematics of what they endured are just staggering. Geographically speaking, the distance from Karbala to Kufa going through Najaf is roughly 57 miles. To put that into perspective, even in a car today, you're looking at over an hour's drive. But the historical texts tell us this captive caravan left on the desolate morning of the 11th of Muharram and incredibly arrived in Kufa by that very same evening. They were forced to march 57 miles across burning desert sand in just 10 to 12 hours. Now, you're probably wondering how they moved that fast, right? Well, the crucial point is how this speed was achieved and the terrible toll it took. To intentionally humiliate the family, the Umayyad forces put the women and children on barebacked camels. There were no howdahs, those wooden frames or canopies that offer a bit of balance and shade. Nothing. The pace was so relentless that exhausted children frequently fell right off the camels onto the hot sand. And according to the historical accounts, there wasn't a single moment of rest allowed on this entire 57-mile trek. Just try to imagine the sheer physical endurance it took to merely survive that day. Moving into Section 2, the awakening of Kufa. 10,000. That is the number of heavily armed guards stationed at literally every corner of the city. As the caravan arrived at Kufa, which, by the way, was formerly known as the Dome of Islam, they found it completely transformed. The sources note Kufa was under an intense military lockdown. It was practically strict martial law, banning anyone from carrying weapons. The governor, Ibn Ziyad, was clearly taking absolutely zero chances with this caravan's arrival. And inside those city walls, there was this immense, chilling disconnect. On one hand, you have the Umayyad state propaganda machinery in full swing. Citizens were told a rebel group had been crushed, the markets were decked out, festive music was blasting, and these massive crowds had gathered to celebrate. But on the other hand, you have the stark reality. The captives were actually the respected family of the Prophet Muhammad. So the uninformed public was out there wildly celebrating the captivity of their own spiritual lineage. The sources give us a really specific, heartbreaking anecdote that captures exactly when this realization hit. A local woman, hearing all the noise, came up to her roof. She looks down and sees women without veils on barebacked camels and heads raised on spears shining like the sun. When she called out to ask who they were, Bibi Zainab replied that they were the family of Muhammad. The woman was just struck with grief. She desperately started throwing down clothes and veils from her roof to help them, but the guards immediately confiscated every single item. It was in these very moments that the horrifying truth began to dawn on Kufa. Which leads us directly to Section 3, the historic marketplace sermon. So the caravan is now right in the middle of this packed, chaotic market. According to historical eyewitnesses, the crowd was now openly weeping, having finally realized exactly who the captives were. Right then, Bibi Zainab simply made a hand gesture for silence. And what happened next is described in the sources as almost a spiritual command. Absolute silence fell over this massive crowd. People literally held their breath. The texts even explicitly mention that the bells around the animals' necks completely stopped ringing. In this absolute, terrifying silence, Bibi Zainab began to speak. And she delivered a speech that would echo through history. She started by intentionally invoking my father, Muhammad, to instantly shatter the state's propaganda. Then she used this precise, piercing Quranic metaphor. She said, "Your example is like that of a woman who spins a strong rope and then unravels it herself." She was expertly dissecting the hypocrisy and betrayal of the Kufan people, telling them they had built something strong only to destroy it with their own hands by abandoning their true leaders. It's a powerful reminder, right? Showing us just how quickly a society can undo its own moral foundation. The immediate aftermath of her sermon was staggering.
The city was completely transformed. The sources tell us that the very same people who, just moments before, were celebrating a state victory were now in a state of sheer shock. They were weeping bitterly, physically tearing their collars and biting their hands in deep shame. A single sermon from a captive woman had entirely dismantled the governor's carefully crafted narrative.
Let's look at Section 4, Confrontation with Ibn Ziyad. Shifting from the streets to the ultimate seat of power, the Dar al-Imara, the sources describe this highly theatrical setup by the governor. He wanted to show off his absolute power. But the reality became a display of pure dignity amidst tyranny. While the arrogant governor tried his best to humiliate the captives, Bibi Zainab walked in quietly in her dust-covered clothes and just sat in a corner. Her maids immediately formed a protective circle around her to shield her from the gaze of the court. She completely, utterly refused to acknowledge his power. Clearly irritated by this, Ibn Ziyad tried to provoke her. He mockingly asked how God had treated her family. Her response is recorded as one of the most powerful retorts in history. She simply looked at him and said, "I saw nothing but beauty." She explained that martyrdom was written for them, and they had beautifully embraced their destiny. That one statement completely nullified the governor's attempt to frame their deaths as some sort of divine punishment. It really shows us how unshakable internal conviction can just completely disarm external intimidation. So, failing to break her, the governor turns his anger toward the ailing Imam Zainul Abidin, who was heavily bound in chains. After a tense, heated exchange, Ibn Ziyad actually ordered the young imam's immediate execution. But instead of begging for his life, the imam fiercely responded, declaring, "Martyrdom is our inheritance." This brilliantly illustrates that the family's spiritual resolve simply couldn't be broken by the threat of a sword. Finally, Section 5, Imprisonment and Enduring Legacy. Following that intense court confrontation, the political tides in the city began shifting rapidly. But first, the captives had to face the agonizing conditions of the Kufa prison. And the contrast between their physical environment and their steadfastness is just incredible. They were placed in strict isolation, absolutely no locals were allowed to visit. There was a severe lack of food and water, which left the children crying from hunger. On top of that, masters and servants, men and women, were all confined together in a single, harsh space. Yet, the texts emphasize over and over that they maintained perfect patience, never uttering a single word of complaint against God. Let's look at the timeline of this captivity. The accounts indicate they arrived in Kufa around the 13th of Muharram, and they endured this brutal imprisonment for 1 month and 7 days. Now, you might be wondering, why so long? Well, because Ibn Ziyad was terrified. The sermons in the marketplace and the court had completely exposed the truth, and he feared a local uprising. He actually had to write to Yazid in Damascus for instructions. Eventually, Yazid ordered the caravan to be dispatched to Damascus under a massive, heavily armed military escort just to prevent local tribes from trying to rescue them. Which brings us right back full circle to our opening question. How did a captive caravan turn a prison sentence into an eternal victory? By standing chained in courts and marketplaces, they used nothing but their words and their unwavering conviction to dismantle an empire's propaganda. The historical sources show us an absolute masterclass in resilience, ensuring that while their oppressors faded into the dust of history, the legacy of these captives remains vibrantly alive today. So, I'll leave you with this. What does it truly take for truth to outlive power? Think about that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.